They evicted me to a freezing basement on Christmas. What they didn't know was simple. I was the one paying for the house. The house in Denver was 70 degrees, but the air at the dinner table felt like absolute zero. My brother Ryan didn't even look up from his plate when he said it. Megan needs a proper space to grow her brand. A content creation studio. My mother Cynthia nodded in that bobblehead way of hers, agreeing before he even finished the sentence. That meant the unfinished basement where I slept on a cot next to the water heater wasn't mine anymore. They needed it for storage. You need to be out by New Year's, Ryan said. It wasn't a question. It was an eviction notice served over Christmas ham. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I walked down the stairs, leaving the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon behind. With every step, the temperature dropped until I could see my breath puffing out in small white clouds. My room wasn't a room. It was an unfinished basement in a drafty Denver house built in the 70s. There was no drywall, just exposed insulation that looked like pink cotton candy but smelled of dust and decay. The floor was raw concrete that radiated a bone-deep chill, sucking the heat out of anything that touched it. My bed was a camping cot pushed up against the water heater, the only source of warmth in the subterranean freezer I called home. I sat on the edge of the cot and unlaced my work boots. My lower back seized up a sharp reminder of my reality. I am a physical therapist. For 12 hours a day, I lift stroke victims who have lost control of their bodies. I teach accident survivors how to walk again. I carry the dead weight of other people's trauma on my spine. My job is physical, exhausting, and essential. And after a shift of carrying the world, I came home to sleep on canvas stretched over aluminum because, according to my mother, I didn't need comfort to sleep. I was young. I was resilient. I was the strong one. It hadn't always been like this. 6 months ago, Ryan and his wife Megan had moved in. It was supposed to be temporary, a quick pit stop, while Ryan launched his latest business venture. They took the master bedroom immediately. Ryan claimed he needed the ensuite bathroom for his morning meditation routine, and Megan needed the natural light for her social media presence. I was displaced without a discussion. Just a casual comment from my mother that the basement would be quieter for me anyway. I wrapped a wool blanket around my shoulders and stared at the pilot light of the water heater. For a long time, I used to wonder if they hated me. I used to agonize over what I had done to deserve this demotion in my own family. But tonight, listening to their laughter drift down through the floorboards, I finally understood the mechanics of it. They didn't hate me. Hate requires passion. Hate requires acknowledgement. This was something colder. I realized I was suffering from what you might call the Atlas complex. In architecture, the most important element of a building is the foundation. It bears the weight of the walls, the roof, the furniture, and the people. But because it is buried underground, because it never cracks and never complains, the people living inside forget it exists. They assume the roof holds itself up by magic. I had made their lives so seamless, so structurally sound, that I had become invisible to them. I wasn't a daughter or a sister anymore. I was infrastructure. And you don't thank a support beam for holding up the ceiling. You only notice it when it breaks. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked as they moved around the kitchen, probably scraping the leftovers into the trash. They were warm. They were full. And they had absolutely no idea that the foundation they were walking on was about to shift. I wasn't going to break. I was going to remove myself from the blueprint entirely. And when you remove a load-bearing wall, the house doesn't just settle. It collapses. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, the screen glowing harsh and bright in the dim basement. I opened my banking app. My thumb hovered over the login button, a familiar hesitation creeping in. For the last 5 years, this had been my secret ritual. I logged in and scrolled down to the scheduled transfers. The numbers stared back at me in bold black font. $1,100 for the mortgage. $1,000 for the pharmacy covering my mother's oxygen and the cocktail of medications she needed to breathe. $2,100 a month, every month, without fail. My mother Cynthia believed in ghosts, specifically the ghost of my father's pension. She thought that check deposited every month was his legacy, his way of taking care of her from beyond the grave. The truth was far less romantic. Dad's pension had run dry 5 years ago. I was the one who opened the letter from the fund administrator. I was the one who read the words "final disbursement." I looked at my mother that day, frail in her armchair, clutching a photo of him, and I made a choice. I chose silence. I chose to become the pension. I told myself it was noble. I told myself I was protecting her dignity. I didn't want her to know that the man she idolized, had left her with nothing. I didn't want her to feel the crushing weight of poverty in her final years. So I stepped in. I picked up extra shifts. I skipped vacations. I drove a car that rattled when it idled. I poured my life into that account so she could keep her pride. And Ryan and Megan, they believed the lie too. They thought they were living off Dad's money. They thought they were entitled to the family wealth because they were family. They didn't see me as the provider. They saw me as a parasite living rent-free in a house paid for by a dead man. I looked at the auto draft scheduled for the 1st of January. It was set to pull from my savings account, the account I had drained almost to zero to keep this charade going. Sized up silence. That's what I called it. I had sized up the situation, calculated the cost of the truth versus the cost of the lie, and decided the lie was cheaper. But tonight, staring at the insulation hanging from the ceiling like stalactites in a cave, I realized I had done the math wrong. My silence hadn't bought her dignity. It had purchased my own erasure. By hiding the source of the money, I had hidden my own value. I had signed a contract that said, you can hurt me, you can use me, you can throw me in the basement, and I will still pay the bills because I am too afraid to let you see the truth. I had handed them the weapon they were using to bludgeon me. They weren't ungrateful because they were monsters. They were ungrateful because they didn't know there was anything to be grateful for. I had made myself invisible to protect them, and now they were treating me like empty space. I tapped the screen. The menu options unfolded. Edit, skip, cancel. My finger trembled. Canceling meant chaos. It meant the oxygen company would call. It meant the bank would send notices. It meant the illusion would shatter and the jagged pieces would cut everyone. But then I thought about Ryan's voice at dinner. Megan needs a content studio. I thought about my mother nodding. I thought about the cold seeping into my bones from the concrete floor. My silence wasn't protecting her anymore. It was enabling them. It was the only thing keeping this toxic ecosystem alive. If I wanted to survive, I had to break the contract. I had to let the ghost die so the living person could finally be seen. I stared at the cancel payment button until the pixels started to blur. The motel room was ugly, mustard yellow walls and a carpet that smelled like stale cigarettes, but the heater was humming, filling the space with glorious dry heat. I took a breath expecting it to be cold, but it was warm. I wasn't freezing. I moved the cursor. Click. Are you sure the screen asked? Yes. Click. The mortgage payment canceled. I opened the pharmacy portal next. The oxygen, the blood pressure meds, the inhalers. Click. Confirm cancellation. Yes. Click. I sat back the laptop screen, casting a blue light on my face. There were no tears. My pulse didn't even spike. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow clarity. For years, I had been operating under a delusion I called the vending machine fallacy. I thought relationships were transactional. I thought if I inserted enough coins, coins of sacrifice, coins of silence, coins of money, eventually love and respect would drop into the tray. I kept feeding the machine, shaking it, kicking it, wondering why it was stuck. But tonight alone in a Motel 6 on Christmas, I finally understood. The machine wasn't stuck. It was empty. It had been empty for a long time. There was no love to dispense, no respect to be earned. I could have poured $1 million into that house and I would still be the girl in the basement. I could have paid for every pill my mother swallowed for the rest of her life, and she would still look at Ryan with adoration while handing me a chore list. I closed the laptop with a snap. The screen went dark. The atlas had shrugged. I wasn't holding up the sky anymore. I wasn't carrying the weight of their world on my back. I was just a woman in a warm room with a bank account that would finally stop bleeding. I lay down on the motel bed, pulling the scratchy duvet up to my chin. For the first time in months, my back muscles relaxed. I wasn't waiting for a thank you that would never come. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I had evicted myself from their narrative, and in doing so, I had finally found a home. It wasn't much, but it was warm and it was mine. I closed my eyes and slept, the silence of the room heavier and more peaceful than any prayer. 2 weeks later, I was sitting on the floor of my new studio apartment assembling a bookshelf. The space was 400 square feet, less than a third of the size of the house I had left, but it felt enormous because it was empty of them. The air was still. The only sound was the hum of my refrigerator and the traffic outside. I had my own heat. I had my own silence. I had a front door that locked and nobody had a key but me. Then my phone started to vibrate against the hardwood floor. It wasn't a call. It was a barrage. The screen lit up with notification after notification, a strobe light of panic. I picked it up and watched the chaos scroll by. It started with a voicemail from the medical supply company. The delivery of portable oxygen tanks was on hold. The account was 30 days past due. Next came the email alert from the bank. The mortgage payment had bounced. Insufficient funds. The autodraft had tried to pull from an account that no longer existed. Then came Ryan. His texts didn't look like messages from a brother. They read like a middle manager screaming at an incompetent intern. He used words like unacceptable and misappropriation. He asked where the asset allocation had gone. He accused me of administrative negligence. He truly believed that I was just the secretary of the family estate, and I had forgotten to file the paperwork. I scrolled through the wall of text. He wasn't asking if I was okay. He wasn't asking where I was sleeping. He was threatening me. Fix this immediately, or I am involving the authorities, he wrote. This is financial abuse of an elder. You are embezzling Dad's legacy. I set the phone down on the coffee table. I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, clinical fascination. They still didn't get it. They were drowning, the water was rising past their necks, and they were screaming at the lifeguard for stealing the ocean. They honestly believed that the money appeared by magic, and I had simply turned off the tap out of spite. They thought the pension was real. I opened my photo gallery. I scrolled back 5 years to a folder I had named The Truth. I found the image. It was a scan of a letter on official letterhead from the pension fund administrator. The date was 5 years ago. The subject line read Final Disbursement Notice. The balance was 0. I didn't type a paragraph explaining myself. I didn't defend my character. I didn't point out that I had been sleeping in a basement while paying for their comfort. I just attached the image and hit send. I watched the delivered receipt appear. I waited. The 3 dots of typing appeared, then disappeared. Then appeared again. Ryan's reply came through a minute later. He hadn't read it. Or if he had, his brain refused to process a reality that didn't serve him. Stop gaslighting us with fake documents, he wrote. Put the money back in the account or I am calling the police. I blocked his number. Then I blocked Megan. Then I blocked my mother. I put the phone on silent and picked up my screwdriver. They wanted the police. They wanted an investigation. Let them call. Let them bring an auditor into their lives. They were about to learn the difference between an asset and a liability, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was going to pay the bill. I went back to building my bookshelf. It was going to look perfect against the wall, right next to the heater that I paid for in the home that was finally undeniably mine. It was a Tuesday morning when the criminal twist finally snapped the last tendon of our family bond. I was at work reviewing a patient's rehabilitation plan when my phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from Ryan, then another, then a text that simply said, "Pick up. Emergency." I stepped into the hallway and called him back. I expected screaming. I expected more threats about the police or the oxygen company. Instead, I heard the sound of heavy traffic and wind, like he was standing on a street corner, hyperventilating. He asked what I did to the accounts. He asked why the bank officer was threatening to call the authorities. I leaned against the cool wall of the hospital corridor and asked him calmly where he was. He hesitated, then admitted it. He was in the parking lot of First National Bank. He had gone there to take out a home equity line of credit on Mom's house. He wanted $50,000 to fund his content studio, figuring he could leverage the equity and use Mom's pension to qualify for the loan payments. He had walked in wearing his best suit, acting like the patriarch, ready to sign papers on a house he didn't own using income that didn't exist. He told me the loan officer had laughed at him. Not a polite chuckle, but the dry, incredulous laugh of someone looking at a fraudster. When Ryan presented the application listing the monthly pension income, the officer pulled the last 5 years of bank statements to verify the deposits. Ryan was screaming into the phone now, his voice cracking. He accused me of hacking the bank records. He said the officer showed him the transaction history and the deposits weren't labeled State Pension Fund or Veterans Affairs. Every single deposit for the last 60 months was labeled P2P Transfer Lauren. He couldn't process it. He asked me how I changed the bank's digital records. He asked me why I put my name on Dad's money. The delusion was so thick it was almost impressive. He had just nearly committed bank fraud by lying on a federal loan application, and he was still trying to find a way to make me the villain. I spoke slowly, using the same voice I use for patients coming out of anesthesia. I told him there was no hack. I told him to look at the document I had sent him 2 weeks ago, the one he refused to read. I told him that the reason the bank officer threatened him with fraud wasn't because I changed the records, but because he had tried to borrow money against a phantom income. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The wind rushed against his phone microphone. I could hear the cognitive dissonance breaking his brain in real time. For years he had treated me like the help. He had treated me like a squatter in his inheritance. And in one humiliating meeting in a glass-walled office, he had learned that I wasn't the squatter. I was the landlord. I was the bank. I was the only reason he wasn't homeless. He whispered something I couldn't quite hear. I asked him to repeat it. He said, "It's all gone." I told him it was never there. I told him the only thing that was real was the $1,100. I transferred every month, and since he had evicted the source of that funding, he was now standing in a bank parking lot with a credit score that was about to implode and a mother who was effectively destitute. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt clean. The secret was out. The lie that had allowed them to abuse me was dead, killed by his own greed. He had gone looking for gold in the walls of that house, and instead he had pulled the pin on a grenade. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. 2 days later, there was a knock on my apartment door. It wasn't the aggressive pounding of a brother coming to intimidate his sister. It was a frantic, desperate tapping. I opened the door. They stood in the hallway like refugees from a disaster I had engineered. Ryan was still wearing the suit from the bank, but it was wrinkled. Now the tie loosened, his entrepreneurial veneer cracked wide open. Megan was behind him, shivering in a coat that looked too thin for the weather. And my mother sat in her transport chair, her portable oxygen tank hissing with a low, dying rattle. The gauge was in the red. They looked cold. Deeply, thoroughly cold. The heat had been shut off at the house that morning. The pharmacy had stopped the deliveries. The reality of their life without my subsidy had finally frozen them out. Ryan didn't scream. He didn't threaten me with the police. He looked at the warmth radiating from my apartment, at the clean floors and the functional lights, and he looked humble. It was a terrifying, manipulative kind of humility. He stepped forward, hands open. He told me they had nowhere to go. He told me Mom was struggling to breathe. He tried to hand me the guilt, wrapping it in the same old packaging of family and duty. He said, "We can fix the paperwork later, just help us now." I didn't move aside to let them in. Instead, I turned to the small table by the door where I had prepared for this moment. I picked up a single folder. I walked out into the hallway and placed it in Ryan's hands. He opened it. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a reinstatement of the auto draft. It was a spreadsheet. Rows and rows of black ink turned to red. Every mortgage payment. Every pharmacy copay. Every utility bill. At the bottom, bold and double underlined, was the total $110,000. Ryan stared at the number. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked from the paper to me, his eyes searching for the glitch, the mistake, the explanation that allowed him to remain the victim. I looked at my mother. She was wheezing slightly, clutching her blanket. For years I had been the invisible infrastructure of her life. I was the steel beam buried in the wall, holding up the roof so she could sit in her armchair and pretend the sky wasn't heavy. Now that I had stepped out from the wall, the roof had collapsed. And standing there in the wreckage for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at the sky. She was looking at me. I spoke clearly, my voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "Look at the total. That number was the price of their comfort." Then I delivered the truth that would finally end the mythology of our family. I told my mother that Dad didn't leave her a pension. I told her he left her with debt and a foreclosure notice 5 years ago. I told her that I was the pension. I was the legacy. I was the safety net. And on Christmas Day, when she sat at the head of the table and nodded while they evicted me to the freezing basement, she hadn't just kicked out a daughter. She had evicted her pension. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. Mom made a small choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth as the shame finally hit her. She realized that her dignity hadn't been preserved by her husband's memory. It had been purchased with my suffering. I reached back onto the table and picked up a second piece of paper. It was a list of state-subsidized care facilities within a 50-mile radius. I placed it on top of the spreadsheet in Ryan's shaking hands. I told him that since he was the man of the house now, he would need to make some calls. I offered no platitudes about family. I offered no curses. I stepped back into my apartment. I looked at them one last time, 3 people standing in the cold, holding the receipt for a transaction they could never refund. I closed the door, I turned the deadbolt, and I went back to my warm room. The fallout was as predictable as gravity. Without my invisible subsidy, the house was sold at a loss to cover the debts. Ryan and Megan filed for divorce 3 months later. Turns out her commitment to the family brand didn't extend to poverty. My mother was moved into a state-subsidized facility. She is safe, she is fed, and she has professional care. I made sure of that. But I don't visit. I don't set myself on fire to keep her warm anymore. I am sitting in my apartment now. The thermostat is set to 72 degrees. On the counter sits a high-end espresso machine, a $1,000 luxury. I denied myself for 5 years because I was too busy paying for someone else's roof. It hums quietly as it brews. It is the sound of my own life finally beginning. I take a sip. It tastes like freedom. I am no longer the foundation. I am just a person standing in the sun, finally warm. If you've ever set yourself on fire to keep others warm, share this story. You deserve to be warm too.